everybody. This is Beltana Spellsinger, and this is my friend, my very good friend, Tara Anura, who lives in Rolla. Say hi, Tara.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here.
So glad to have you here with us today. So, today we are going to be interviewing author Brandon Weston. Brandon is a healer and a writer and a folklorist living in the Arkansas Ozarks. He is author of the Ozark Mountain Spellbook and Ozark Folk Magic, Plants, Prayers, and Healing, and owner of Ozark Healing Traditions, a collective of articles, lectures, and workshops focusing on traditions of medicine, magic, and folklore from the Ozark Mountain region. He comes from a long line of Ozark hill folk and works hard to keep the traditions that he's collected alive and true for generations to come. So let's welcome Brandon Weston.
Hi, Brandon.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. I've always wanted to attend a workshop, and I saw your TED Talk and have your book. So this is wonderful. Thank you so much for being on Belle's show.
Of course.
Thank you. So are you enjoying the spring so far? Are you planting any seeds?
I am enjoying the spring. It's one of my favorite times of the year. Spring and fall, because I'm not an extreme weather person. So, and in Arkansas, the winters are pretty extreme sometimes, and summers are pretty extreme. So yeah, I definitely like the springtime. So people always ask me if I do like a big garden and stuff like that. And I always kind of have to laugh because I do not have a green thumb, oddly enough. Like I've tried gardening and stuff just doesn't come up. So I have a lot of native medicinals that I've planted, but those are really easy. You just throw them out there and they spread. It can go crazy. But this is the time of the year I like going out and foraging a little bit and seeing what is popping up new in different places and stuff like that. So I always tell people, get me out in the woods. I can tell you what all the plants are and their uses, but get me in a garden and I don't know what I'm doing.
So are there specific plants out there in the Ozarks that you're most fond of? I mean, I know you've said in your book that there are hundreds and hundreds out here in the Ozarks that we can use for medicinal and spiritual remedies, but what are some of your favorites?
So my three favorite Ozark plants, red cedar, which is actually a juniper. Juniperus virginiana, eastern red cedar. So it's not actually a true cedar, it's a juniper, but you can use it like you do European juniper. So it's really good for purification, and you can burn it as a smoke to clean out illnesses and evil spirits and all sorts of stuff. I really like sassafras, which is an Ozark native tree. It has a lot of medicinal and magical benefits to it, and all of the Monarda, so bee balm, lemon bee balm, wild bergamot, they're all in the Monarda genus, and we have 5 or 6 different native species here. And they're all beautiful. They're hummingbird flowers. So they have these sort of pitcher-shaped flowers that the hummingbird can get its beak down into. And they all are in the mint family. So they have crazy amount of medicinal benefits. And they're also one of our magical plants, specifically for detaching spirits. So if you have spirits attached to you, you can use Monarda to detach them. So yeah, those are definitely my 3 favorites.
So is using the juniper kind of like using a sage to sage an area, sort of?
Yeah, so you can burn it, like let it smolder on coals and use the smoke. It's used in a lot of house cleansing rites and things like that. You can burn it in the room of somebody who's sick and to clear out the bad air and the sickness and things like that. So it has a lot of benefits. You can also, it's used in water cleansing rites too. So mixed with water and then cleansed the outside of the body. So it has a lot of really good cleansing benefits.
Very cool.
Oh yeah. I just wanted to say, I know people try to be very respectful of Native American traditions. And some tribes say, please don't use the natural white sage. So often in Ozark magic, which the Ozarks go all the way down to where you're at in Arkansas and all the way up here to almost St. Louis in Missouri. So I often use bay leaf too, which grows in Missouri, and I love the smell of cedar. It's that kind of a crisp evergreen scent, just really not only uplifts the mood, but I can see how it can definitely be a deterrent, for spirits, because not only does it to empower you, to take control of a situation that needs to be cleansed, but there's also that deep magic in the cedar and the juniper.
Yeah, and juniper has a long history of that type of use, even throughout the highland areas of Europe too. So German folk culture, continental German folk culture, French folk magic, as well as folk magic across the British Isles, all have some sort of connection to European juniper, common juniper. Scottish, in particular, have a big connection to juniper. And a lot of the Scottish people that eventually came to the Ozarks, they found a juniper here. They found the red cedar. And so they actually used it in the same way that they would have used common juniper back home, which I find to be very, very interesting.
Cool. Mm-hmm. So you say you're a multi-generational Ozarker on both sides of your family, right? You traced your family tree back to the time of the first settlement area from back in the 1800s in the Appalachian Mountains. Like where is your family like from, and what is a little bit about your family history?
Yeah. So both sides of the family, my mom's side of the family has a lot of German immigrants. My dad's side of the family is what's connected mostly to the Ozarks. So the Ozark region was settled around 1800 by Appalachian hill folk who came to the area after the forced removal of the Osage by the U.S. government. So the land was opened up to whoever wanted to settle it, and it was mostly Appalachian hill folk that came here. And so my Ozark family goes back to the time of that settlement, and before that, they were mostly in Tennessee, northern Georgia, and North Carolina. That's sort of where those areas sort of meet. It's mostly where my family was from. Then before that, lots of pan-British Isles, so Welsh, Scottish, Cornish family. Then I have German family as well, and French and Scandinavian. Like a lot of Appalachian people and Ozark people, it's just sort of, throw a dart at a map of Europe and from there probably. So, yeah. But on my dad's side of the family in particular, goes way back in the Ozarks, various regions, and as well as the Ouachitas. And so when we're talking about the modern Ozarks, I always like to bring up what I like to call borderland areas. And these are areas that Ozark people moved to after the Ozarks. So I still consider them to be Ozark, even though geographically they aren't. So the Ouachita Mountains, even though they're a different mountain change, separated by the Arkansas River, Ozark people went south into the Ouachitas very early on and brought their culture, that sort of pan-Appalachian culture, to the Ouachitas as well. And then you can even look at, being from Arkansas, you can look at the River Valley area, you can look at the Delta, you can even look at the swamps of South Arkansas and see Ozark influence. So it's kind of all over the place. And so I have family from sort of have been in the Ouachitas and in the River Valley as well.
I feel like we have so much in common. My ancestors came over in that same grouping of Germans and Scottish people and Irish and Welsh and British that came over into Virginia, North Carolina, into Appalachia, and then eventually, as the Osage were forced out, came here to Missouri. So I'm about fifth, sixth, seventh generation. I'm not sure how far back of immigrants and Ozarkians. I wanted to ask you about coins. if you don't mind, because I have a fond memory of my grandpa always making sure we had dimes in our pockets. And we could not turn it in for quarters because when I was a kid, video games were still popular where you know, pop a quarter in or put your quarter on top and wait in line for your turn. And he was like, he would get aggravated, not like mad, but he'd get aggravated if he found out we had changed our dimes in for quarters because those dimes were meant for our luck and protection. Like if grandpa couldn't be there to watch over us, we had to carry these dimes. And you talk a little bit about Ozark Magic and coins in your book. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, or if you have any memories of coin magic from your childhood or now.
Sure. Yeah. Coins, Ozarkers in general have always had this spirit of repurposing things around the house for magical or healing uses. And so you don't go out and buy new things or have specific things for certain purposes. You repurpose what you've got. And so coins have definitely featured into that. So there are a lot of wart charms that involve coins. So, leaving a wart on a penny and then leaving it at the crossroads or putting it on a fence post. Dimes in particular used to be 100% silver. And so dimes have had historically an important feature in Ozark folk magic because of the silver in it. And so in Ozark folk magic and folk belief, silver is a highly prized protective metal. Will protect against a lot of things. I mean, we have kind of culturally, the idea of the silver bullet that will kill evil and things like that. Silver was a very important metal, not only because it was valuable, because it is connected to the full moon. And so Ozarkers have always been what I like to call moon people, because, we plant by the phases of the moon, we heal by the phases of the moon. We use the zodiac moon signs as a part of our folk medicine and magical practices. And so because of this, you have dimes, which have this silver quality, which are connected to the full moon. They even sort of look like a full moon. And so there's this idea of power, of prosperity, things like that. I know a lot of times I've met some old timers who always kept silver dimes around just in case they had to melt them down and make them into a bullet to kill evil monster or something like that. They definitely also feature into folklore and Ozark folk stories as well. But coins in general have a huge use in Ozark folk magic and medicine practices. So I had a great uncle on my dad's side who was a wart charmer. So he could specifically, of the people whose gift it was to be able to get rid of warts, there were different specialties, I guess, underneath that. And so my great uncle specifically was a wart buyer. So he could buy warts off of people. And usually he used a dime or he used a nickel or sometimes a penny. But in a lot of cases, it was a dime because of that magical quality that's inherent within that sort of silver. Even though now, there's so little silver in dimes, but they still hold that sort of luckiness, that quality about them. So what he would specifically do was if you had a wart, you would sometimes go find him at like family reunions and things. That's the only time I ever saw him was funerals and family reunions. But you would go find him and you would say, Uncle Bill, I have a wart. Or sometimes he would find you. Sometimes, he would hear that you have a wart. And he would look over and say, oh, that's a good one. I'll buy it off of you. And he would hand you a coin and you would take it. And he would go away, you would go away, and then overnight the wart would disappear.
Really?
Yeah. And so I have family members. My dad had been cured several times of warts. I remember when I was a kid one time, I don't know if it was a wart or like a pimple or if I didn't really know what a wart was when I was a kid, but he bought something like that off of me when I was a kid and it went away overnight. So, yeah.
Wow.
So coins have a lot of sort of magical qualities about them.
I still have to carry my keys or change in my pocket to hear that jingle because I got so used to my grandpa making sure we had dimes.
There's
Me and all my cousins.
There's a good luck ritual too involving the dime. And the dime and the full moon, or sometimes depending on who you're talking to, it's the new moon, but most of the time it's the full moon because it's a dime, and so it's that full moon magic quality. But so you put a dime, or sometimes it's just something silver in your right pocket, and you go out and you see the full moon and you greet the full moon. So you say something like, "Good evening, full moon." And as you're saying that with your right hand, you turn over whatever the silver item or dime or coin it was in your pocket. And then you go back inside. And that brings you luck until the next full moon when you do that again.
I love it.
Very cool. Very cool. Tell us more about Ozark healing traditions in general. How did you learn? Was that something that was just passed down to you through the generations?
So, not from my family. So when I first started getting interested in this, I was mostly interested in the folklore side of things. So I was collecting folk stories and home remedies and things like that. And I've always kind of had an interest in plant medicine and home remedies, things like that. And so I discovered Vance Randolph. We were talking about Vance Randolph earlier. So that was my first sort of, I guess, eye-opening moment that maybe I come from a culture. So yeah, Ozark Magic and Folklore. So
right.
I found that book, and I found things my family were doing in the book. So as I was reading, I was like, wait a second, I've seen this stuff being done. So from there, I started collecting stories from family, whatever anybody wanted to give me. And then I sort of broke out from there into communities in the Ozarks, mostly because I really wanted to see where we were today. So is this medicine and magic and all of these traditions still around today? Vance Randolph. So that book was first published in 1940.
Wow.
And so, his research was around the turn of the 20th century. A lot of his informants moved through the Civil War. And so today it's very different today in the Ozarks. And so one of the things that really drove me and still drives me is this idea of collecting where we are now, how we've changed, what has evolved, what has been brought into the practices. And so I just went out and started talking to people. And pretty soon after this process started, I realized that the academic sort of folklore track wasn't for me. I wanted to hear people tell stories. I wanted to collect the practices to be able to use them. I had one of my informants who was a healer and became a teacher of mine. She sort of identified the gift within me, which is a part of this sort of Ozark healing tradition. You know, most of the time in the past anyway, if you were going to learn any sort of healing practices, you had to be identified as having the gift, which means that you have this sort of inborn sort of quality. And a lot of times it has to do with circumstances of when you were born. So if you were born on certain days of the year or under certain circumstances. So if you were, children who had umbilical cords wrapped around their throat at birth and then survived that, or born in the caul, which, part of the placenta being over
the veil, the caul.
The veil, as it's sometimes called. So all of these sort of eerie, strange circumstances can point to somebody having this innate gift within them. And so even though growing up, I grew up out in the woods, I was talking to trees and fairies and all the time. And so, I didn't really think anything.
I love you even more now, Brandon.
I didn't really think anything about it, but I met this lady who was very, very, very intuitive with stuff like that. And she said, no, you have the gift. That's why you're here. That's why you're collecting this stuff. And so from there, it was less about the academic side, less about making a museum exhibit about the Ozarks, and it was more about I'm a living practitioner now, and so I want to learn, and I want to learn to be
Right.
able to heal. I want to be able to work with people. I want to be able to help the community. And so everything sort of changed after that. And so I started meeting other practitioners and teachers and things like that. And instead of carrying like a little voice recorder, recording stuff, I just sat down with people and said, hey, what can you give me? What are you willing to give me? And it was very surprising sometimes the amount of stuff that people were willing to give me. So
I think you're a natural story catcher, because not many people in the Ozarks will open up and talk about, what some people would call old family superstitions,
Mhm.
which may go back to, religious beliefs at some point, or just methods for people to cope with poverty and illness when they are so isolated out in rural areas. But that's a big compliment to be a story catcher like that and have people open up to you.
And what really helped the process was putting aside, the tape recorder and the pad, writing down stuff, just approaching people and asking for stories without any of that. People were much more willing to open up because they realized, oh, this is somebody that just is interested in reclaiming the culture or learning about the culture. They're not here collecting stuff to sell, because that's the whole thing in the Ozarks is, we have historically a huge distrust for strangers and outsiders, because since the very beginning of getting here in the 1800s, people have tried to profit off of the land that we live on and, make our living on, and profit off of the culture, whether it's healing traditions or folk crafts or music or whatever it is. And so, being an Ozarker, first of all, being able to tell people where my people are from helped me a lot, to sort of get trust with people. But then also just being able to sit down and say, hey, I'm just wanting to learn this stuff. I'm just wanting to hear the stories, and what I remember, I will remember, and what I don't remember, that's okay. So, and people appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a reason that they want to, people want to keep it as sort of a secretive culture. I mean, what advice could you give to people to bring that knowledge to others in a way that would feel comfortable for them, if that's even something that, wants to be done? Because like you said, I mean, people will take certain plant species and just sort of over harvest them. And so how do you prevent that from happening and still share the knowledge with people in a nice, safe, and sacred way and respectful way?
Yeah. So, I mean, specifically with like plants and things like that, I always tell people to stockpile knowledge, not plants. So, there, so learn how to identify things, but leave things where they are. And so you will know how to use the plant for later, for if you need it later on. And it's kind of the same way with, healing rituals and prayers and charms, whatever it might be. This idea of approach the practice where it is. So, I get a lot of people asking, I'm not from the Ozarks, can I practice this stuff? And yes, of course, like it's not a closed practice or anything like that. I mean, I feel like most of what makes up Ozark Folk Magic has some cultural ties to, all the different cultures in America and also across Europe and North Africa and West Africa and indigenous traditions here. So I think everybody kind of has a hand in Ozark folk traditions. But I always tell people, if you are going to practice this, if you are going to learn about this, respect the land and respect the people and the entities that are on the land. And so Ozark folk traditions are still very closely tied to the land and protecting the land and making sure that the land is taken care of. And that has always been a very big part of Ozark folk culture. It goes all the way back to 1800, when you have people who are living on the land who need to protect the land in order to survive. If you destroy the land, you aren't going to have water next year to drink, or
Right.
your crops aren't going to grow, that sort of thing. And so it's one of those foundational things within the Ozarks, is protecting the land, and then protecting the communities, not just the physical human communities, but the ancestors that are here, the ancestors before us. I mean, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of years of inhabitation of the Ozarks that don't include white people. So
Right.
respecting
Most.
not only respecting all of those ancestors, respecting all of those lineages, and respecting the land as a way of respecting those ancestors and individuals. And so there are lots of traditional ways of approaching this. I don't consider myself a very traditional person. I'm a neo-traditional practitioner. So a lot of what I collected was collected in non-traditional ways, because there are so few practitioners today that we can't uphold the old traditional ways of passing things. So, used to pre-1950, 1960, the way of passing down this stuff was you never wrote anything down. You always passed things down word of mouth. And you always pass down things from an older person to a younger person. You always pass things down cross genders. So man to woman or woman to man. You always pass things down, in some cases, through bloodline. So you have to pass things down to a younger person, not of your gender, in your family. And unfortunately, the situation that we're in now is we can't uphold these things, because in some families, nobody's interested in this. I've met several healers in the Ozarks, old timers, who were willing to give me a lot of stuff, even though it didn't abide by the old taboos. They were willing to pass me a bunch of stuff because they were nearing death and they had no one in their lives to pass things to. And so we're in a very different situation now, where things, in my opinion, things have to be passed down non-traditionally in order for the practices to survive. And so I don't feel bad about publishing a lot of the practices. People always ask me, well, these practices are secretive, why are you publishing them? And the practices that are in my books are all practices that I was given or developed through my own practice through these sort of non-traditional ways. And so I feel like it's fine for me to pass them down in non-traditional ways. I always tell people, as much stuff as in my 2 books right now, there is so much more that I won't ever publish, that I will only pass down to a student or to an apprentice or somebody through word of mouth, because I feel like that is an important part of the tradition still for certain things. But there are other things that, can be widely disseminated, can be widely put out there, and for anybody to incorporate into their lives and their practices.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I can understand how people would want to keep certain things, sacred, and the reasons why, like we just said earlier, because of plants, and just, the respect of the cultures that came before us and the ancestors that came before us. So you said that we Ozarkers have always had a hard time sort of defining ourselves, because we're not quite Southern, and we're not quite Midwestern, we're not quite Appalachian. In many ways, we're a mixture of all three with a whole lot more added in.
Yeah. That has sort of defined the Ozarks, since the very beginning. And even, we can say that by most of the first white settlers to the Ozarks were from the Appalachian Mountains. But what does that mean? Those families weren't just one thing. Most of them didn't even call themselves Appalachian people. They were just, they were hill folk, they were mountain folk, and a lot of them retained their original sort of identities too. So they were Germans living in these mountains. They were, Norwegians living in these mountains, and that sort of thing. So even before coming to the Ozarks, it was already an amalgam. It was already a big melting pot of a lot of different cultures, and not just European cultures. The Appalachian hill folk that came to the Ozarks, a lot of them were mixed raced families. And so indigenous families, as well as Black families. So you have all of those traditions that sort of mix and mingle together and then came over as well. And so it really is. I mean, you know, it's hard to define yourself in any American culture. But I think specifically in the Ozarks, it's even more complicated because we have been sort of at the crossroads of a lot of different regional cultures. So like I was talking about earlier, I mean, the Ozarks is in the middle of, you know, the western expansion into Kansas and Oklahoma. It's in the middle of, you know, I mean, we border on Indian territory in Oklahoma. So you have cross-cultural influences there. All of the cultures that came into the River Valley in Arkansas that passed through that and passed through the Delta region. In Missouri, on the very eastern sort of side of the Missouri Ozarks, you actually have, there's a Ozark Cajun French dialect that is fortunately dying out, but it is located around Old Mines, Missouri. And so you had French Canadians, Cajuns, that were coming into the Ozarks. And so I think, you know, historically, one of the ways people have, not from the Ozarks, and some people from the Ozarks have profited off of the Ozarks and Ozark people is by really defining us as one thing. And that has traditionally been Scots-Irish, Protestant, hillbillies. So, and that's a way that people have really profited off of the culture and have completely disregarded all of the nuances underneath that, have completely disregarded the fact that up until, you know, the mid to late 1800s, there were, I think, upwards of 15 thriving Black communities in the Ozarks around the Arkansas-Missouri border. And so they completely disregard that influence. They completely disregard the indigenous influence from hill folk that came over, Cherokee, Muskogee Creek hill folk from Appalachia. They disregard that. And so the story of the Ozarks is much more complicated. And so part of really the work that I do and sort of my calling right now is setting the story straight, as at least from the perspective of our healing and folk magic traditions, which have also been sort of misunderstood, misinterpreted, and profited off of for about 100 years now. So
I have a comment I'd like to share. So I read, interestingly enough, that Brad Pitt, who's from Missouri, he learned some of that Ozark Creole mixed language, and I think he actually took time to speak with a woman, one of the last few people who knew that language up. Maybe it was the Bonne Terre area where we have a lot of mines. And I find that fascinating because my grandfather, the one who kept giving me the dimes and everything, he came from a Lutheran German background and a French Canadian background. So his family migrated from Canada and picked coal off the ground when it was still a very surface mineral before they started to have to dig mines. And that's how that branch of the family came to Missouri. And then I was hoping to talk about simmer pots. Are you? Yeah. Oh, you're familiar. Okay. So my stepmom, who was of Scotch-Irish heritage, she had so many solid rules in our house about a few things. Everybody took a bite of the black-eyed peas on New Year's Day. If you didn't like it, you held your nose, you took a spoonful, because she didn't want bad luck in the house for the rest of the year. As the oldest, it was usually my job to keep the simmer pot going. Like, don't add anything to it. Stir it once in a while. Add more water. Do not let it run out of water. Like, it was like a huge responsibility when she was at work and I had to keep the simmer pot going. But she'd put like cinnamon, cloves, cedar, sometimes bay or eucalyptus if we had that. And it was always, she would usually say, "Oh, it smells good, but it keeps the illness away." But it had a feeling it was also to keep like other things out,
Mhm.
you know. So maybe you can talk a little bit about herbs and water and pots, simmer pots like that.
Yeah, no, I definitely grew up in a house with a simmer pot. Yeah, but mostly in the winter, we had
Hmm.
simmer pots.
Yeah, if it was super hot and humid, we didn't do it.
Right. No, you don't want like extra steam inside of your house while it's already so humid. But no, definitely grew up in a house. We had the simmer pot that wasn't used for anything else.
Exactly.
And when, after the winter, it was cleaned up and put back into the back of the cabinet for the next winter then. So no, I can definitely relate to that. And yeah, it's one of those interesting things. I mean, it definitely has a much older tradition about it, I think, and it goes beyond just like making the house smell good. Ozark folk belief, there are a lot of sort of magical remedies connected to smells. So that's why, you burn red cedar or juniper. It's because the smell and the smoke helps clean out things. And so, yeah, I have a theory that simmer pots probably go back to that too, that idea of burning these or boiling these plants and the steam cleans out the air. I remember, and I've talked to old timers, all who, they swear by certain times of the year you have to air out the house. And so you
Yeah.
open all the windows up. And in some cases, some of the old timers that I talk to, they actually talk about burning red cedar in the house while they're doing this as a way of cleaning the air. And so there's this idea of, the bad air in the house can cause illnesses, but I think it's also probably connected a little bit to, entities and things like that you might not want to hang around. And so opening up all of the windows, burning the red cedar or a simmer pot or something like that, and then, allowing the wind to sort of naturally carry that stuff out of the house. So yeah, I consider that to be a form of, smoke cleansing, which is very similar to water cleansing in that the water cleansing, pouring water over your head or bathing in a river, the idea is that it's carrying the sickness, it's carrying the evil with the current. Or if you're pouring in the water over your head, which is a traditional Ozark way of doing cleansing baths, it's carrying it down and down the drain. And smoke kind of does the same thing. So the smoke sort of picks up things into it, and then when you open up the windows and it blows out, it carries that with it. Or I've seen some people open up the windows, you burn the red cedar, and then one lady I met, she had a special little broom that was like a little homemade broom, and she would go around the house through the smoke and she would brush the smoke out the windows or like towards the windows. And this idea of sweeping, you're not just sweeping the floor clean, but you're sweeping the air clean too. You're sweeping out the smoke and all of that. So yeah, there's definitely this connection between scents and smells and things like that, and healing and magic. One of the most famous Ozark, I say healing plants, even though it wasn't ever taken internally. It was always used externally, but asafoetida, or asafoetida, as it's sometimes called. So it's a resin from a root that actually, or a plant that grows in the Middle East mostly. It doesn't grow in the Ozarks, but you could get it as a resin supplement through the pharmacy. And it smells like a combination of raw garlic and onions that has kind of been setting out in the sun for a while. So it's a very pungent odor. And so in the Ozarks, people would go to the pharmacy and they would buy little things of asafoetida, and they would put it in bags and make their kids wear it around their necks to keep illnesses away. The idea being,
and their friends away.
And their friends away. Yeah. Probably actually how it worked was keeping everybody away with germs. But the idea behind it is that bad smells or pungent smells or sharp smells, smells that have a power to them, have the ability to clear air, to clear out bad air. And we can actually trace this directly back to Greek and medieval European medical theory with miasma,
Oh, yeah.
this invisible air that goes around. And so asafoetida was actually very popular in medieval Europe too, in the same way that it was used in the Ozarks. People would wear it in bags to keep away these bad airs. Sulfur powder was another one. And so, bad smells or sharp smells in particular in the Ozarks were traditionally ways of getting rid of things. There was one old lady I met who every spring she swore by two things. Every spring you have to drink at least 1 cup of strong sassafras tea to clean out your digestive system, but also to clean out your blood and your liver in the springtime. And you have to air out your house. And specifically, her process of airing out her house was she would, with all of the windows and doors closed, she would burn sulfur powder and asafoetida on hot coals, which, let me tell you, that the smell of that was enough to get anything out of the house. So she would burn that in the house until it was real smoky. Then
you banish.
And then she would open up all of the windows and the doors, and then she would go around fanning out the smoke. And so this was a very powerful method of sort of getting out illnesses and stuff like that. I like to use red cedar. I always tell people you don't have to use asafoetida in your house if you don't want to. Red cedar does just as well, and it smells a lot better.
I mean, they used to do that back in the day, didn't they? Like even in Versailles, they'd have these huge censers and they'd just be walking around the palace with them and, you know, healing the ill. And
yeah, the idea of the smoke cleaning the air or cleansing the air. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you if you had any interesting and sort of maybe spooky Ozark folklore tales that you wanted to share with us.
Sure. Yeah. So part of the work I do is working with the spirit world and working with spirits and things like that. And so people will occasionally call me out to their house to do like house cleansings and things like that. And there for a while, I haven't done one in quite a while, but for whatever reason, and this is kind of a way that things like this work in the Ozarks, you'll work with one person and then they'll tell somebody and then they'll tell somebody and so on. And so for about a year, a couple times a month, somebody would call me to come clean ghosts or spirits out of their barn. Specifically
out of their barn.
Specifically barns. And I guess I was good enough at it that they then, somebody would have trouble with their livestock or with their barn. And so then the person I work for would then tell them to call me. And so I haven't gotten any barn calls in about a year, but they were always very fun. And they were fun for me. Some people don't think that sort of thing is fun.
Right.
But for me, I definitely, have, I can sense things in the other world and things like that in different ways. So I definitely have the sight, or the second sight, as they say in the Ozarks. And so I was pretty good at it. And so I would take red cedar and smoke out spirits and things like that. But there was one time in particular, I went to this barn that was in a little bit of a spooky place. It was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And normally I don't go that far outside of a town, just, because you never know what's going to go.
Right.
This old guy was like well vouched for in the community. So I knew he wasn't going to, kidnap me or something. And so I went out and he was very nonchalant about his haunted barn. He was just done with it being haunted, I guess. And so I was asking him, what sort of things was going on, and he said, well, every night when the sun goes down, all you have to do is stand out here, and you'll start hearing like loud, like clapping against the wood, and like something's hitting the wood. And I was like, okay, well, sun going down, it's probably cooling off. It's probably the wood expanding and making some weird sounds. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll hang out. And so I hung out in a field in the summertime. And yeah, as soon as the sun started going down, you would hear a pop. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to stand down. I'm going to go in and see what's going on. And so I went inside and was like, okay, I'm listening for these popping sounds. And the best I could describe it, it sounded like something was pulling the boards on the side of the barn out and then letting them slap against the side of the barn.
Wow.
And so I was like, okay, well, that's a little different. And so I was like, well, maybe I can, if I'm still enough, maybe I can see what's going on. And I could see, every time it made the slapping noise, I finally was able to see the like wood beams, like wood siding of the barn shake. You could see it back after it made this sound. And so I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. So I just did some of the work that I burned some, red cedar. I went around the barn 3 times counterclockwise with some red cedar and tobacco. I left out some offerings. I did, a reading to see, what was kind of going on there. And through that process, I will say most of the time I have done anything like this. And when I do house blessings and stuff still to this day, the process of going through this sometimes solves things. You don't necessarily have to exercise a spirit or anything, but giving it that attention, or noticing it, caring enough for it to leave some food and some water out as sort of offerings, or caring enough to do like a tarot reading, or I use geomancy, so doing like a geomancy reading for the spirit. That's sometimes enough to work through the problem. And it was it was unexplainable. I did this process and did the reading and worked through some things with the spirits that maybe needed to be resolved, said some verbal charms and some prayers, and the clapping stopped as soon as I was done. And according to the guy, never started back up again. And so that normally the places that I've gone to have not had such overt sort of activity. Sometimes it's just a weird sort of feeling, or like an eerie sort of feeling in the place. But this was one of the first ones I had done that had very physical signs of presence.
Goodness. Were you in there by yourself?
Yeah. And a lot of times when I do things like that, if I can, a lot of times I'll sleep in the location too. Because I do a lot of dream work. And so a lot of times things will come in the dreams, ways of working out the problems, or I'll have an ancestor visit and tell me what's going on, or things like that. This one, I didn't even have to sleep. It was just sort of like an off switch, just sort of like turned off the activity.
I can really relate with what you're saying. I've learned through books, watching people who had these customs and didn't necessarily say it was Ozark Folk Magic, because I was raised by Methodist ministers and Baptist ministers. So often gifts were said to come from the Holy Spirit, because otherwise could it be the devil, right? But my grandma had the gift of communicating with spirits, and I inherited that. I remember when she'd be, and it's interesting because now I feel the connection too between the scent and even taste, because she'd get in a mood to bake a peach cobbler, and then she'd start humming a hymn or something. And then one day I finally asked her, because she seemed just the way she was baking seemed so intent. And she seemed so focused on the music. I'm like, Grandma, you seem so happy. Why are you humming? And she said she heard the angels singing because someone had died. And sure enough, because this is back when we still had landlines, the phone would ring and it would be the church prayer tree. And a member had passed. So Grandma would have the cobbler ready, to take to the family. She was singing to help with the angels to help the person cross over. And I've kind of picked up that same gift, kind of what you're talking about, of sensing someone who's stuck somehow or just needs some compassion so they can move on. And often, and it's not always necessarily an old homestead where, where you're hiking and you come across a foundation where you might feel that, but it can be in newer homes too. If someone has an ancestor, a loved one who's feeling kind of overlooked. And I try to connect a lot with my great grandma, who was a midwife in the Ozarks. And she learned how to stoke the fire right to help warm up premature infants, either to the side or just do the really simple cold. It was like an incubator, and I asked her to help guide me learning on my own in these traditions. And I learned a lot about, you sweep to the left to clean things out, and then you could sweep to the right to bring things in. And you had to catch if the wind changes and you start to get the new smells of the season, and there's almost like the taste of the rain coming in the air or something. You open up your windows and you let all the good, smells in and everything. And there's something about Ozark Magic that helps us remember the land we are on and our roots and family. And I think that's something we're really missing in modern society right now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always tell people, the foundations of Ozark Folk Magic are in the land and in the home. And that this connection to simplicity and this connection to using what's on hand and creativity in that too. I mean, Ozark old timers were so creative in their methods. Anything around the house they could pick up and they could pair it with a verbal charm and do whatever they needed to do. And so there's this real sort of creativity about it, this cunningness. In Britain, these gifted people were called the cunning folk for a reason, because of this cleverness and this creativity to be able to just sort of work magic. I always tell people, going back to like the old fairy tale, being able to spin gold out of straw is really, it's this sort of foundational connection in the Ozarks is being able to use whatever you've got on hand to do what you need to do. A quote that I will never forget and has been so influential on my practice. One of my teachers, the teacher that actually identified the gift in me, one day we were in her kitchen and I was asking her about tools and like what she used, because she was making herbal medicine for somebody. And so she had wooden spoons that she was stirring it with. And I was asking her, are these special wooden spoons? Are they made out of a certain type of wood? Did you bless the spoons when you make them? Did you do this? Did you do this? And she just stopped me. Like, she had this way of stopping me by just, holding up her hand. And I knew, okay, I'm going to stop. And she just sort of looked at me and she said, as a healer, you should be able to do everything you need to do in a completely empty jail cell. And that has always struck me, that is the heart of this practice, is you and your gift, and that's it. That's all you need. And everything else kind of just is really the icing on the cake. I always tell people, magic is this river. And the quickest way, the easiest way to get down the river is just to sort of lay back and let the river current take you. Spoon, yes. And so letting the current of the river take you downriver is the quickest way to do that. And that is the heart of at least Ozark practice, is you being in the flow of your own gift, your own power, the power of the Holy Spirit, whatever you want to call it. And then on top of that, using ritual tools and magical timing and verbal charms and prayers. This is like building a boat. And so you're building a boat and you can get where you need to go maybe faster. Or if you need to work against the current, you can do that with a boat. But really, the easiest way to work is to just work, is to just rely on your intuition, rely on that gift, rely on that connection to this sort of innate flow of magic in the world around you. And I mean, wonders can come from that.
You don't need all those tools, but yeah, like you said, it's like a boat. If you want to go faster, use the tools. It's like a visual aid.
I see Ozark Magic as you said, flowing with the land, flowing with the right timing, flowing with the cycles, and being in tune with our body cycles and the cycle of community and the seasons of the world around us. And I think one reason that so many people in the Ozarks are drawn to Christianity could be because of baptism in the river. You go down, like the song, "Let's Go Down to the River and Pray." And when you're literally dunked in the water, it's especially if it's super cold or fast, you're gonna come up taking that deep breath, and it's gonna be cold and refreshing and very cleansing. One of my favorite ways to recharge and relax is just floating on the river. And I really hope when tourists come to our area, they'll, instead of trashing the land and not picking up after themselves, or making fun of hillbillies, they'll give themselves a chance that when they're swimming or they're floating or camping, to just be present with the unique smell of that iron earth and the crisp water and our plants, and learn to maybe slow down a bit and get back into their own natural rhythms.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I hope too. That's exactly what I hope too. And I think there is a magic about the Ozarks and I mean, I've talked to enough people who are not from the Ozarks, but have been to the Ozarks, and they all confirm the same thing. Is people can't come to the Ozarks and leave different. They aren't quite the same. There's something about it, especially if you go to the natural areas or float in the river, or, go to a swimming hole or something like that. There, I don't know. There's a unique sort of spirit about the place. And yeah, that's one of the things that I really want to get out to people, is this idea of, this is here. And it's not just for a certain group of people, it's for everyone, but we all have the opportunity to take care of it and to maintain it for the future, so that this sort of magic will keep going with people.
I'm so thankful for the Blue Spark too, because I know, Val, you're trying to bring that sense of hope and connection back to rural folk and people across the U.S. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. This is wonderful. Do you have anything else that you'd like to share with us, or any clues as to where we might be able to find your stuff?
So both of the books are out. They're across the internet. They're both from Llewellyn Worldwide, so you can get them on the publisher's website, as well as bookstores around. I'm always surprised. People will email me and say, the most recent one a couple of weeks ago, somebody emailed me and said, "I found your book in Sydney, Australia." So,
my goodness.
And what was really strange, and this is a story that I've heard so many times with Ozarkers and people who have been displaced from the Ozarks. So this lady in Sydney, Australia, was born in Australia, comes from an Ozark family in Australia, had not thought about the Ozarks, went into a bookstore, and there was one copy of Ozark Folk Magic that she found, and was able to pick it up and reconnect to her Ozark ancestors in Australia. So it's another one of those weird things about the Ozarks. Once you start like going down the rabbit hole, you never know where it's going to take you. But yeah, so the books are out in lots of different places. I have a website, ozarkhealing.com. And that's where I post information about upcoming classes. I do virtual classes as well as in-person classes. So all of that information is on the website.
All right. Well, the Ozarks are definitely a magical place. I'm glad that you're a part of it. I'm glad to be a part of it too. And I wouldn't have met Tara and other people that I've met out here over the last couple of years if it weren't for this place. And I'm very grateful to be able to live here. And it's good to meet other people that even though you live in a different state, we're all part of the Ozarks, right? I mean, the Ozarks is pretty expansive.
Yep. And we're a part of what I like to call the greater Ozarks too, is all the Ozark people that have gone out and, gone to different places and done different things. I think we take a little bit of that Ozark magic with us wherever we go. So.
Especially when we put iron and calcite in our pockets. But yeah, the Ozarks are pretty big. They're part of Oklahoma, and it goes down into Arkansas and almost up to St. Louis. So yeah, it's a big region. Some of the oldest, not quite as old as the Appalachian mountains, but some of the oldest in the U.S. and the world. Mm-hmm. All those caves and limestone and fresh, underground rivers. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and a ton of, we have a ton of fossils and stuff. One of my favorite places to go to, which I unfortunately won't say where because I don't want other people to go there. But there's a huge creek that runs through this valley. And it's made up of, the bottom of the creek is this sort of flat limestone. And one of the locals that I was talking to out there who kind of invited me to the area, I was like, oh, this is really pretty with the smooth rock at the bottom of the creek and everything. And he said, yeah, that's about 1 million-year-old seabed.
Yeah, this used to be the ocean.
And they pull out
wow
and stuff. And so it was an interesting experience being able to, I led a cleansing ritual in the creek standing on top of 1 million-year-old seabed.
Oh, my toes are tingling.
It
was a very, very beautiful experience. So yeah, there's a lot of very wild and interesting things in the Ozarks.
I'm sure there's quite a few practitioners with shark teeth in there.
Oh yeah. Yeah, sharks.
And their pile of accoutrements or tools.
Lots of fossils, and I don't even know all of them, but the curly ones.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, on the subject of fossils and stuff. So the Ozarks, we are on it. It's called karst topography. It's basically Swiss cheese underneath us. We are also a hub for crystals, and there are a lot of very interesting crystal stories that I've collected from people, including one old guy who was a crystal digger, sort of down in the southern Ozarks, almost to the Washitas. But he had a story about when he was younger digging crystals, he got into this cave system and found a room where there were quartz crystals that were 6-7 feet tall, these quartz tips underneath the ground. And so it's a very interesting place if you're interested in like crystals and fossils and stuff like that. The Washitas, Mount Ida, Mount Magazine specifically, they have like crystal fairs and crystal festivals, and everybody will bring out stuff to sell and stuff. It's a really cool area for crystal diggers.
Yeah, that reminds me, there's a big tourist industry of crystal hunting in Arkansas.
Yeah, in the Washitas mostly. But we have like the diamond crater, where people dig diamonds up all the time. Well, not all the time, but occasionally.
I think.
Yeah. big diamonds sometimes, depending on the time of the year. But yeah, it's a lot of really interesting stuff. And that also, the sort of crystal network underneath the Ozarks also, I think, has an effect on the sort of magical streams here.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah, all the limestone made from the sea creatures that built up over the ages, because for a long time our world was mainly an ocean.
Yeah.
And then we have all the water flowing underground and the connection of the various crystals. And you're right, there's so many crystals, because I know people will go to creek beds, after a big rainstorm when it's safer, because so much dirt's been moved, and you can pull like crystals out of and they're not like the big fancy already like polished chiseled kind you'd expect. It'll be just like usually a hunk sticking out of some sandstone with some red, but you can also find obsidian here when you get around to like the Sam A. Baker Park area, because the Ozarks used to be volcanoes. So I know obsidian's popular to find, and sadly, so many highways were blasted through our mountains here. So you can often just go, like, if you can find a low traffic area and just find crystals on the side of the highway.
Wow.
But I'm saying that people don't go out and just start grabbing crystals, because
right.
you gotta pay homage. You gotta have a sense of reverence about it, and leave some water or something for the land spirits, and try to have a relationship instead of just stealing.
Yeah, that's an important part of it, not just taking.
I could talk with you guys forever. I'm like, I just want to thank you so much, Belle, for having me on your show. And we're all here smiling and having a conversation. And I really hope for months to come, this is what the Blue Spark can do, is like reignite that spark in people to have these kind of conversations about community and spirituality and the beautiful rural land we live on and how we want to protect it. So thank you so much for having Brandon on here and having me to the show.
Thank you, Tara. And thank you so much, Brandon. It was really nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you all. And yeah, thank you for having me on.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll see you again.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be great.